Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. Um, right now, we are about to have our panel on criminal justice reform and the role of prosecutors in that reform. If you're here for that, that's great. If you're not here for that, then you're welcome to stay. You made a happy little mistake. Um, so just to start, I'm going to go over some of the background of our panelists here, and then we'll get things going with some questions. Um, Also, we welcome questions from the audience as well. There's a QR code up there you could use on your phone to submit questions that I could go over at the end of the session, or you are welcome to raise your hands at the end of the session, and we'll have a Q&A session then as well. So yeah, let's get started. So first, I would just want to introduce our panelists. First, we have John Choi, who in 2011, John Choi was sworn in as the first Korean American chief prosecutor in the US. Since taking office, John has become a state and national leader in progressive justice reform, working with public officials in impacted communities to reimagine justice and the role of prosecutors. Choi received the 2015 Minnesota County Attorneys Association Award of Excellence for his innovative leadership in better prosecuting sex traffickers and helping trafficked children. Previously, he served as St. Paul City Attorney and spent a decade in private practice. And as I mentioned, he's now the chief prosecutor in Ramsey County. And then Kevin Reese Kevin grew up in Minneapolis, and while incarcerated within the criminal justice system, he founded Bridge, which is a grassroots organization directly impacted criminal justice experts whose mission is to abolish mass incarceration. He's currently the executive director of Until We Are All Free, where he leads work at connecting the people behind walls and connecting them to people on the front lines of criminal justice reform. And Mary Moriarty is graduated from the University of Minnesota Law School in 1989. She spent 31 years as a Hennepin County public defender, becoming a renowned trial attorney. She's tried numerous cases in Hennepin County and argued cases all the way up to the United States Supreme Court. In 2014, she was appointed as the first female chief public defender in Hennepin County. And as chief public defender, her office exposed that low-level marijuana stings and routine traffic stops in Hennepin County overwhelmingly affected Black residents. Mary Moriarty is also a professor here at the law school, and she's currently running for the office of Hennepin County Attorney. So now I just want to turn it over to our panelists. If you would like to just begin by telling us anything else you want us to know about your background and the work that you currently do. We can start with you, John.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for being here and inviting the three of us to be a part of a conversation to talk about kind of like what prosecutors can be doing, the role of the prosecutor, to improve the quality of justice in our communities and really across the nation. There's a growing movement of reform-minded, progressive prosecutors that are being elected. I have the honor and privilege of being connected with them through a number of national networks. I've really gotten to enjoy being able to work in the space with them, but also to have the shared challenges and the struggles to support one another. I started this work when I was appointed the St. Paul City Attorney by then Mayor Coleman, who had just been elected mayor in 2005. And my career to get to where I am today is, I often tell people it was very accidental. I didn't ever think that I would be doing work in the criminal justice system or in prosecution. And so I was in private practice for about 10 years before I had gotten the call from Mayor Coleman to be the city attorney. And I had a lot of background in municipal law, but I didn't have any background in criminal law at all. In fact, I remember when I was in your shoes, I probably tried to avoid criminal law classes. because I just didn't think that that was in my future. But having been appointed the city attorney, I was very comfortable with the municipal civil aspect of the work, but the criminal work I was not. And so I think I just kind of spent more time in that area, and I fell in love with it. And I also didn't have the past experience of having been raised as a prosecutor. I didn't come into an organization and no one ever told me, this is how we do things. I came into the organization as the person who was in charge. And I saw the world in a very different way. I felt that many of the things that were happening in the criminal justice system, especially in the context of misdemeanor level prosecution, just simply didn't make sense. That we were processing people and that we weren't really getting good outcomes. One particular area was in the area of people who drive without valid licenses. There's thousands and thousands of people who don't have valid licenses, but they drive anyway. And then they are pulled over, and then they're stopped, and then they're given a citation. And then they go further into the hole, right? And none of that made sense to me because the average person had about $1,500 of past due fines and fees, and nobody could ever get themselves right because it was too hard to dig out of that hole, and the court didn't take payment plans. So we came up with a way to fix that. But I just loved being able to see how we could improve things and make things better for the people that we serve. And so that's been the journey that I've been on. And I certainly am a very different prosecutor than I was even back then, doing a lot of diversion work to today. I see the world in so many different ways, and I'm so glad that we can have a conversation about the future role of a prosecutor and what we can do to improve justice for all people in our community.
Thank you, Troy. My name is Kevin Reese. One of the things I was found on is I'm founder of Until We Are All Free. 3 years ago, I was in a Minnesota correctional facility thinking about these same issues, talking about these same issues, but I was talking about it with all folks who slept next to toilets with me. And criminal justice is something that we care deep about as well, too, because we had family members who are in community. We want our families safe. We have friends and loved ones that we care about in community. We wanted to see them safe. We had dreams. We wanted to see some of those flourish. So Until We Are All Free, this is the mission of Until We Are All Free. When we're having spaces like this and we're talking about criminal justice and the impact that it has on community, when we was in prison, we was like, they're talking to everybody but us. We're the ones who have to, with our very life, think of creative ways to try to make sense of this system. Thinking of creative ways to try to make this injustice thing feel like justice for our human spirits, to say, this thing happened, but how do we get out of it? Sort of like you were just saying, Troy, like in courtrooms with something like that, where the court don't take a payment plan, and they will continue to give folks citations and put them deeper and deeper in a hole. This hole would eventually land you into a prison cell. So Until We Are All Free, the spirit of the organizing that I began to do in prison was for spaces like this, when conversations like this was happening, for us who had that direct impact experience to join that with the table, to be able to say all of these things. Shout out to all of the folks who's taken this academic approach to this criminal justice issues that we're having. But we also need the folks who've had to adjust to the system and maneuver through the system with their very life. And Until We Are All Free is a platform for us to be able to do that. And what I'm doing these days is a whole lot of this, a whole lot of setting precedent for when these spaces is taking place, for our opinion and our expertise to not just be heard, or for us to come to the table just grateful to be at the table, but for what we have to say and our experience and our expertise to be listened to, and for this to be part of this future that we're trying to build for all of us.
So I was just thinking about 30 years ago, I was where you are, and this room hasn't changed much. But I was thinking about my trajectory. I knew when I came to law school that I wanted to be a public defender. My father had been a part-time public defender. And just last night, I was actually thinking about the Journal of Law and Inequality, and I was a member of the Journal of Law and Inequality, and I actually wrote a piece called Liberty, Justice, and Experts for All. And it was about the fact that back then, if you were a poor person and you needed an investigator or an expert, there was a cap of $300 on the amount your lawyer could spend for an expert. And I ended up interviewing someone who is very influential, who took my article and me actually to the legislature and got that changed. And I looked at the legislation last night, and it remains what it was changed to. And so I think this was really inspirational to me, and I was thinking about, you guys can change a lot of things, and the way to change our system is all of you, and we need all of us. John was talking about he came into prosecution not being very familiar with the criminal side. I, as a public defender in Hennepin County for 31 years, was quite familiar with the criminal side. And when people say to me, how can you be a prosecutor if you've never been one? I say I am actually probably more qualified than anyone else, because for 31 years I sat in a courtroom and I watched what actually happened. Not what prosecutors said they did, but what they actually did. I sat next to the Kevin Reeses. I represented the Kevin Reeses of the county. I know their backgrounds, the trauma that they bring, the fact that if we look at their histories, we can see all kinds of trauma, and had we intervened at an earlier time, they probably wouldn't be there. I also can think way outside the box because I've never been a prosecutor, and as John said, he came in and he didn't know how things were supposed to go, so he was in charge, and he could do what he thought was the right thing to do. And so I can think outside the box because I haven't grown up in a system that's always done things the way it always has, without questioning whether it actually keeps us safer and whether it actually works for the community. And so I bring empathy. I understand. I can't tell you how many victim impact statements I listen to, where I heard people who'd been harmed talk about the things that they wanted to know, and to know that the system wasn't offering them what they wanted or needed, nor does the system really ever ask them. And so I bring to this place today a lot of understanding that where sometimes we hear prosecutors and politicians call somebody a perpetrator, and then there's a victim, and they think that there's never any back and forth. And we know somebody who was today's harmed person may very well be tomorrow's person who harms somebody else. And we have very effective ways of stopping that and intervening. And I've followed what John Choi has been doing in Ramsey County, and he's been very innovative in a way that we haven't seen in Minnesota. He's also been attacked pretty mercilessly by narratives that just aren't correct. And so when I say it takes all of us, I really agree with that. It takes all of us to have the political will to say we want something different for the people in all of our communities, and that we are going to stand behind the people who are trying to change that in good times and bad. So I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you to all of you for being here and for giving us your thoughts on this issue. And it's amazing to hear how your scholarship is affecting the law even now, and I think that's a really important thing for us all to remember, that we are, as students, are going into this and can make the change. So the progressive prosecutor movement, if you want to call it that, is something that has gained a lot of traction in the last few years. However, there may be some confusion over what exactly that means. So what does progressive prosecution mean to you, and what does it look like in practice? We could start with you, John.
Thank you. So it's gained traction, but I want to make sure that people understand that it's not the mainstream way of thinking in America. In fact, there's probably only about maybe between 50 to 100 of us around the country, and that's just a drop in the bucket with regard to all of the elected prosecutors in the country. But I think one of the, in terms of looking at what progressive prosecutors or reform-minded prosecutors are doing, is that many of them recognize and they embrace this notion that they have an enormous amount of power over how justice plays out in a community, and that justice has to be for everybody, not just the victim. You know, prosecutors in America, for the longest time, I've seen videos and been at events, where prosecutors are brought to tears because they have done something on behalf of a victim, but the truth is that we represent the entire community. We don't represent just the victim. We represent the person also who stands accused of their crime, and the family as well. So I think it's really recalibrating that notion to recognize that our role is not just to do right by victims, but it's to do right by the entire community, and to recognize that there's something called prosecutorial discretion, that it actually means something, that we cannot be a rubber stamp to whatever the police bring to us, because in many ways a prosecutor is the recipient of incidents and investigations that come to us. So as a part of justice reform, I think that prosecutors have to recognize that they have to play this independent role. Now, of course, the reality is that we have to work with the police to make some of these cases, but at the same time, we have to be an independent, we have to take that independence, and that also means when we have to hold police accountable. So that front door of the system, to not be a rubber stamp, right? And then to ask yourself, what is it that I am actually perpetuating in terms of injustice, right? And then recognize that you also have the ability to actually close the door, right? And so one of the things that I've been doing in Ramsey County is, it is the most controversial thing that I have done during my 10 years, but it's the most liberating thing, because I know that I am doing the right thing. And that's what a prosecutor should always be doing the right thing as they interpret that for their community. But I made the decision that I no longer wanted to perpetuate and incentivize the practice of police pulling people over for non-public safety traffic stops as a pretext to do further investigation. I no longer wanted to perpetuate and incentivize the asking of people of consent to search their vehicles. Because the truth is that less than 2% of those times, they will find contraband, but what about the 98% in which they didn't? And where they may have asked somebody under the guise or suspicion of that person being involved in criminal activity for their consent, right? And so I used to be that prosecutor that believed that practice, because it was completely legal, because the Supreme Court decision 9-0 said that police officers can pull people over on minor equipment violations and then conduct further searches. And as prosecutors, I think it was a prosecutor who probably said, yeah, and ask them for consent too. So then it will be easier for us to prosecute, right? But I also recognize that people who are subject to that stop, African Americans, are 4 times more likely to be stopped in those situations. They're more likely to be asked for consent, but interestingly, they're less likely to actually have contraband found on them. So where in America would we ever allow for some industry or some practice to perpetuate when you're only 2% successful? So in the context of recognizing that practice, that police practice, is not just, that it's unfair, and that change has to be made, I, as a prosecutor, can continue to perpetuate and incentivize that police conduct. Or I can come up with some policy that says that if you pull somebody over with that probable cause, and you find some drugs or guns, and you send that case to me, that the way that I'm going to look at it is that I'm going to disfavor that. I'm not going to prosecute that unless there's some reason why I should prosecute that, where I believe the community should, right? And so today we announced that policy back on September 8th of 2021. And luckily for me, I've been in this role for quite some time, and so I do have partnerships and friendships, and so I was able to announce that policy in conjunction with some of our other police leaders in Ramsey County. But we have not been submitted a case at all involved that implicates that policy. Those traffic stops have diminished mightily. We had a number of cases that were in the pipeline. I did not apply my policy retroactively because I didn't think it was fair to, because we never put people on notice about that. But there were cases before, but today, since September 8th, we've yet to have a policy. So that's an example of maybe how a reform-minded prosecutor can think about utilizing their power, recognizing that they have enormous discretion to influence what gets into the criminal justice system, and also to say what you're not going to be perpetuating or incentivizing. So that's maybe just an example, but there's so much more to talk about in terms of.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's great to hear about, like the specific examples of policies that could be put in place that make a real change in how people experience the criminal justice system. Yeah, Kevin, I would love to hear from you, just as someone who, works every day with people who are affected by the criminal justice system and have to go through the process. Like, what are some ways in your mind that prosecutors can improve things for people?
One of the things that I would say is,
I'm sorry about the mic.
it's cool, right? One of the things that I would say is the power of language, right? To be open to shifting the language of what we call prosecutor. I know for me, my body, my experience, when I hear prosecutor, I hear this archetype, I hear this personality type, I hear this actual functioning role that exists that it's anti-community, that is anti-me. This is the person that has sent me and countless of people from my community to prison. So as long as we are using the same language, we will continue to practice the same practice, right? Because you are stepping into functionary roles. So if we shift, like the idea of having an attorney that advocates for the people, I'm all for it. But what I would like to challenge, do we have to call this person a prosecutor? Right? And then to the prosecutors to say, it's okay, we're not trying to take away the industry or take away your identity, but the way that it lands in community, it's one of the first steps to like creating this divide and creating this bridge where folks don't trust the word prosecutor. Go in community and do like a survey and ask folks, when you hear the word prosecutor, what do you hear? People's nervous system is probably gonna be all out of wax. People's whole entire being, it's gonna like conjure up all of these bad energies, all of this bad spirit from their experiences. And if this wasn't direct experience, it was experience from someone that's close to them or someone from community. So being open to shifting, even Mary just said, in the courtroom, we have perpetrator and we have victim. Like, as long as we are using the same language that the system have that's continuing to perpetuate this cycle, we're going to continue to have this cycle being perpetuated. So one of the things that I would love to see in my lifetime, and while I'm doing this work, is a shift what we call a prosecutor. Not the role, but the title, because in the title is the functions, right? You're functioning as a prosecutor. Second part of the question, it was a two-part question.
Yeah, just like what you think, I guess, a prosecutor or whatever we want to call them, what attorneys in that role you think they could do to improve improve the community and improve how people experience the criminal justice system?
Well, yeah, for sure. So back to what I was just saying, for the attorneys to say, actually, I may be open to shifting what my job title is. When we're talking about in practice, don't stop pushing the law once you become a lawyer, right? Don't stop challenging the law because it's on the books. Don't mean it has to always stay on the books. Because this is the way that it is, that does not mean that it's right, or it does not mean that this is the way that it has to stay. So a progressive prosecutor is one that is advocating for the people while at the same time continuing to push what we consider the law. Continuing to say, actually, this doesn't feel moral. Actually, this is, John Choi just said it, the prosecutor is not only representing the perpetrator or the defendant, the prosecutor is representing the whole community. For the prosecutors to say, well, some of this language is actually triggering to community and it's making it harder for me to do my job. It's making it harder to call families when I got to say, hey, I'm the prosecutor from whatever county, you plug one in. It's making it hard for me to build relationships and community while I'm calling myself this title. It's like if someone was a gang enforcer, right? It's going to be hard for, hey, Mrs. or Mr. whoever, I'm Mr. Gang Enforcer, and I'm calling you around XYZ. You're going to lose folks. So I think one of the ways it looks like in practice for the progressive prosecutor is to be open to say, because this is the role that I stepped into, it doesn't have to be this way when I leave.
Thank you for that. And yeah, Mary, just
Yeah, no, this is a
how
really
you-
interesting question, and it's one I've thought about a lot. And I really do appreciate Kevin's comments about the actual name prosecutor. And what does it mean, progressive prosecutor? And we certainly have people around the country who are held up as the progressive prosecutors. And we have other people who have run on platforms of progressive prosecution, but have disappointed a lot of people in their policies. And so I think where I've landed on this is, regardless of what the title is, I think to be in this position means that you have to understand our country's history. You have to understand our country's history of racism and enslavement and where the system, with Jim Crow laws. And if you go to, how many of you have been to Bryan Stevenson's museum in Montgomery, Alabama? The National Memorial. So he has the National Memorial for Peace. He's got the Legacy Museum. And the Legacy Museum tracks enslavement with the criminal legal system. And it's pretty eye-opening and shocking to see the parallels there. And you have to understand our country's history of, say, the war on drugs. We have on tape somebody in the Nixon administration saying specifically that the war on drugs was a war on Black people. And so I think to be in this position requires knowledge of history and a comfort level with talking about how the system has really hurt people in our community, decimated some of our communities, and to think about what can we do? What can we do to rectify that? And some of it is really hard. A lot of it has to do with root causes. It has to do with investment in communities. It has to do with recognizing some things that we have a very difficult time doing here in Minnesota. We have among the highest racial disparities on every metric you can possibly imagine in Minnesota. It's on income, it's on home ownership, health disparities, just everything. We are also very frequently on the top 5 lists of best places to live if you're a white person. And so that's, with the murder of George Floyd, I was thinking, in my 31 years in the system, this is the best opportunity for a racial reckoning. For us here, many of us who consider ourselves to be progressive, but really don't do a good job talking about race and are very reluctant to talk about race because we consider ourselves to be progressive. But how do we roll up our sleeves and get to a comfort level where we're talking about the impact, not our intent, but the impact? And John was talking about some data in traffic stops, and I'm a big data person. And that's one of the things I did as chief public defender was pull data from the MPD. Because when you can say, as we could from the MPD's own data, that less than 0.5% of the time when police stopped a Black driver for a minor driving violation or equipment violation did they find a gun. Less than 0.5%. And I always flip that around, as John did, to say 99.5% of Black drivers were stopped and searched, put through that trauma, and they had done nothing wrong. So if we can look at data and say, we've got these incredible problems here. And I'm going to say something here that's also something that we have to reckon with as well. The conversations I've been having a lot lately have to do with people who are very frightened about carjackings. And nobody should be carjacked. Nobody. It's traumatic. It's awful. Nobody should be carjacked. But what I've noticed is that most of the carjacking victims are Black. And what we hear about are carjacking victims who are living in neighborhoods that were thought to be safe. And we need to keep pushing the conversation. And this is what I think, and I'm talking about the person who takes the role of county attorney, really talking about, yes, nobody should be carjacked, but our communities of color have lived with violence for decades. We had 3 Black children shot in the head earlier this summer. And that didn't get as much publicity as the one carjacking in the Lunds Byerly's parking lot in Edina. We need to care about everyone's children. We need to understand and treat children who come from our marginalized communities as though we want them to succeed the way we want our own children to succeed. And so the person who comes into this role has to understand that history, be able to own that history, and be able to advocate. I mean, there are certainly policies, but you can also use it, I believe, as a platform to be working with other partners and policymakers to push the kinds of things that we actually have data and we know work to reduce violence. And I think in a bigger picture, that's how I think of progressive prosecution. I guess I do have trouble with that name, but ultimately that's the role the person has to play, to recognize that the system, what the system has done for decades, does not work. We have plenty of data on that. In fact, Rachel Barco, who spoke here a couple of years ago, has written a book called Prisoners of Politics. And one thing that always sticks in my head that she said was, if the criminal legal system was a private corporation, it would be bankrupt a long time ago, because the shareholders would question, is what you're doing working? Is what you're doing keeping us safe? And people just don't know that. They don't know the questions to ask about the system, because I think it's purposely been made mysterious so that people have a hard time talking or being able to know what questions to ask. But it's time we ask those questions. What policies, what are we doing? Why do we have 1/3 of our prison population made up of Black men and women? Why is that when they are about 6% of the population in Minnesota? And what can we do about that? So it's, to me, more of a philosophy and values than it is about a name. And so when I think of what I would do in this role, it is looking at data, it is making decisions that are aligned with my understanding of our history, of the system, the data that we know, the research that we know about things that actually work to help people in our community, everybody in our community, which also will keep us much safer.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and going off of that, I know that, I mean, obviously, John, you and your department have made a lot of like specific policy changes that you've talked about some of them already. But I would love to hear, just taking all of that into consideration, the history of this country and Minnesota and the racial disparities that we see. How has your office translated all of that into policies that you carry out that makes change?
Yeah, and I would echo what Mary said about understanding and being able to articulate and lead within your community to bring it to understand the historical harms that the justice system has caused to many communities throughout our state and our country. For me personally, Mary talked about Brian Stevenson's work. I've had the privilege to travel to Montgomery twice, actually, once with a delegation of Ramsey County folks, and then secondly with a delegation of other prosecutors. But it had a very profound impact on me, and if any of you have a chance to take a trip down to Montgomery, Alabama, I strongly encourage you to do it, because it really has influenced me in a great, profound way. So that ability to understand that, and then a part of what you're going to learn about in Montgomery is about just our history of how we utilize incarceration And we incarcerate people like nobody else in this world. And as Mary talked a little bit about, oftentimes we've just been raised to accept that this is what our reality is and it must work. But the truth is it really doesn't. And so I think another thing about being reform-minded and doing this work is that I think you have to have a very strong value that incarceration is really for a last resort, and you shouldn't be utilizing incarceration unless you absolutely have to. So in Ramsey County, one of the things that we have been working on, and I will not take sole credit for this because I think it belongs to a lot of people, whether it's public defenders, whether it's our judges, but we're a jurisdiction that has relied less on incarceration over the past 10 years. So starting in 2013, we've had a 47% reduction in the numbers of people that we actually send to adult prison. A 47% reduction. And that's the most conservative way to slice that number. It's actually, if you add in some other things, it's probably like 56%, unlike any other county in the state of Minnesota. We're also having less reliance on our local jail, our workhouse. Those numbers have gone down about 30 or 40%. And then for youth, we have to recognize that kids are kids. And so having kids in detention for lengthy periods of time just isn't a good thing, and that we need to develop other ways in which we do those interventions. So our pre-adjudication, pre-trial detention through Juvenile Detention's Alternatives Initiative, going back to 2010, we used to have 150 kids in detention in any one particular day. Today, we have somewhere between 15 to 30 in any particular day. Our use of secure placement has also dramatically gone down since about 2016. So that's one of the, I think, really critical pieces is that we should be working towards an ecosystem and a community and a structure that recognizes that we should have lesser utilization of prison and only use it when we absolutely have to. And if anybody says that because of that, things are going crazy in Ramsey County and crime has gone off the charts, we have had an uptick in crime, but that's because we're in the midst of a pandemic. And we have poverty and instability and civil unrest, all of these things that are factoring, and all cities across America have the same issues. And I would say just compare us then to Hennepin County during that same time period. Their incarceration rate kind of went up and then just a little bit down. Ours steadily went down. The level of crime in Hennepin County and Ramsey County is about the same. So there is no positive correlation. I talked a little bit about the front door. I think there's a lot of opportunity for reform in that particular area about how we make the charging decisions. So one of the areas is just expanding felony diversion. We're an upside down jurisdiction. We typically, in every jurisdiction in America, you would divert more misdemeanor level cases, right, than you would felony cases. We're a jurisdiction that actually diverts more felony cases than misdemeanor level cases. And I'm really proud to say that the level of people who are offered diversion, there really isn't a disparity in terms of how we prosecute people. So the people that we charge, and if you broke it down by race, and the people that we divert is exactly about the same. So we're making some really intentional decisions about recognizing on some of those lower level felonies that we can actually get better outcomes. And there's this misperception that somehow diversion is like not as effective as our court system. Our court system is just a way that we process people. And somehow through this adversarial process, we somehow believe that truth and justice and good outcomes happen. And that's just simply not the case. In fact, one of the biggest lies in America is that the system actually produces trials. Less than 2% of the cases actually get tried. They're actually subject to this whole process of plea bargaining. We can talk about that maybe in a later question, but so it's not that effective. I think oftentimes diversion is more effective, right? I also have a policy right now not to charge fifth-degree drug cases in my office. I took advantage of the COVID pandemic to say that this is a time that we have to be really, our resources are scarce and we have to prioritize violence. So those cases have dramatically dropped. We only have a small number of cases that actually get through under that policy if there's a public safety exception that's made. And I actually announced that policy with some of the support from my law enforcement leaders. Even Sheriff Fletcher and Chief Mathwig and Roseville supported that policy because they recognized that we should not be prioritizing those offenses, and also that those offenses are best, I think, dealt with through a public health lens and through our community. We also have a policy around collateral consequences, which is to be considered at the time of charging and also as a part of plea negotiation. Over the course of the past 3 years, I know that for a fact we have probably stopped the deportation, because one of the most severe collateral consequence is removal from this country for those who are here, many times permanent residents, but they're not United States citizens, and certain felony convictions will subject you to deportation. But I know for certain that we have saved the deportation and removal of this country for over 50 people over the past 3 or 4 years by modifying sentences or taking into account that information as a part of how we resolve those particular cases. There's a number of other things I could talk about, but I don't want to take up all the time. But I think, but one thing I do want to talk about too, I think one of the things too, like I talked about that front door, one of the most important things that we're doing right now, and I think it might be the second most controversial thing that I'm doing, and not enough, we haven't publicly launched it yet, but I believe it should not just be the prosecutor that makes a charging decision or thinks about how we should handle a case. Now, if we're talking about the legal technical piece of it, like is there enough evidence? Can we meet our ethical standard? Is there proof beyond a reasonable doubt? Is there sufficient evidence to prove this case, right? That's a technical decision, but it should also be informed by things outside of the police report. Because if we're just looking at the police report and we're just saying that did a violation of the law happen, and if it did, we rubber stamp it and we move it to the next phase in the justice system, that system doesn't work that well. And so is there a way to think about getting other types of information that could help make a better decision about how we should handle it before we charge it? Because once you start charging somebody with a felony crime, you're creating a record, right? And it really puts people back. And so right now we're starting a kind of a novel project working in collaboration with the public defender and our community for our youth cases. What we're doing is we have a collaborative review team where a public defender and a member that brings a community perspective in our office will collaboratively, we retain the final decision-making authority, and the public defender is always advocating for no charges. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to humanize the child and the family, and what we get is so much more rich information when we reach out to the family and ask for other context. And oftentimes what people want is just help, right? And we can also work in the victim as a part of that resolution. But what we're really trying to do is we're deflect a lot of the incidents and situations that happen. Not everything has to come into the criminal justice system, but somehow we concocted a way to say if you call 911, the whole system starts, right? It's activated. But a lot of things can be deflected back to the community, and quite frankly, I think they can do a better job of resolving it and to do right by the person who was harmed, and to also do right by the person who stands accused of doing the harm. And then also there are people that love the individuals that are involved, and we can do right by them by having a more community-based collaborative type of approach, and to get away from this notion that everything has to fall into the adversarial system. It's just something that we were raised with, but we never questioned it properly. And I think community is where our solutions lie.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I would love to come back to some of the diversion programs and what that actually looks like in practice. Kevin, for you, I mean, you mentioned just a moment ago how when folks that you work with, they hear you ask them about what they think about prosecutor, and they hear that word and they just are gonna tense up, and it's just this very visceral reaction. How do you think what policies, and I mean John mentioned some things that his office has done, but what kind of things can folks in that role do in order to, improve relations with the community as a whole?
Yeah, for sure. One of the things I would say to go meet with John Choi and follow the leadership of what Ramsey County is doing right now during this era is I'm sitting here and I'm listening to him talk. These are part of the visions of what I'm hearing from community. So it's part healing to hear a prosecutor to affirm what community has been saying. And one of the biggest things is the prosecutor's office needs to learn that it cannot and it should not make those decisions by itself. This on one arm of the law with all of this power, and we're going to make decisions based on how we charge folks and how we play this functional part of the conveyor belt to say, no, actually, we want to factor in other things when we're talking about prosecuting someone's case. So I think it's more than practice. It has to be culture. It has to be the whole entire way we see the prosecutor's office needs to be one of community. I would like to urge the prosecuting offices to go do a survey in your community and ask folks, how many folks think that this office represents or it's here to keep you safe? How many folks think?
I'm sorry about that. I don't know why that,
It's okay. And hear from community and allow what you hear from community to affect the culture of the prosecution office. One of the policies for sure is something that I've been talking to Mary about. I went to prison for felony murder. Felony murder was something that I was charged with. At 18 years old, I was involved in a robbery. And during this robbery, someone lost their life. I didn't pull the trigger. I did my time so I could sit here boldly and say that didn't supposed to happen that day. It was a true tragedy. But the prosecutor, there was no space for the prosecutor to see me as the senior in high school that I was, poverty on this particular day. Getting some money sounded like a great idea from my undeveloped brain. But was I a murderer? No. But guess what? I was charged with felony murder, indicted on first-degree murder. I had to plead out to second-degree murder and take a sentence of 22 years, a sentence that I still have 5-6 years of parole under now. If they would have talked to me, I'd have told them, hey, I actually want to go to school. If they'd have talked to me, I'm actually the same person. I'm just older. I just know some more stuff because I've experienced some more stuff. But my spirit and my heart, I'm the same person that I was then. But in the courtroom, the prosecutor only had the police report. And the police report determined how they charged me. And the judge at sentencing even told me, hey, this sentence feels kind of harsh, but the state has to do what we have to do. This is the law. And I left that experience completely shaken up with no trust for the justice system. It felt like prosecutors also can understand that a crime takes place in community. Wrong. And the role that I have, if I don't do it right, I also can be wrong. And that's what's happening. For prosecutors to also see themselves as the powerful entity that it is and says, if we don't do this right, we can actually be more harmful to community than we are being good. Those are some of the things. And being able to have the discretion to decide, is this case actually a criminal matter? Is this person dealing with poverty? Is this person dealing with mental health? Is this person dealing with drug addiction? And the list can go on and on and on, and allow that to determine what happens with them in the courtroom instead of us criminalizing drug addiction, criminalizing poverty, criminalizing misplacement, criminalizing generational trauma. Because what happens is we just create these places that we call prison, and all of that just vibrates. Folks in prison, you know who they're calling? They're calling their families. You know who's feeling that energy of that vibration? Their families. Guess who's have to be in a grocery store next to us every day? Folks, families who are being impacted by incarceration. So the prosecutors to see their position as a very, very critical one. And in that critical role, they have an opportunity. And in that opportunity, they can see themselves more aligned with community, more aligned with the people. But it can't take place behind a podium. It can't take place behind your desk. It has to take place in community. It's going to take some folks being bold enough to challenge America, to challenge the laws and say, actually, the way that this has been functioning, we have been more damaging. We would be bankrupt if we was a corporation. Something has to shift. And while I'm in this role, I will not function like that. I'm actually advocating for the people. It's going to take some courage. It's going to take some brave new spirits, some brave new minds. It's going to take folks that's in power right now to concede some of that power, to know, hey, It is okay if you lose a little power. We're not trying to create a new world to like, you will not be X'd out of the new world. Your experience and expertise is just as valuable in the new world as it is in this world that we're living in. Would be really critical. Also, with juveniles, when we're talking about, one of the questions when I heard John Choi saying that the number of the juveniles that's in the facilities now versus what it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, I thought of, where in the numbers, where are those other kids? Because the poverty hasn't changed, the conditions hasn't changed, these things hasn't changed. But what have we done with the other at-risk youth, right? Is we saying, oh, they're the ones that's in the street that's doing all of the carjacking and creating all of this crime and this chaos? Then it shows that what we were doing 20 years ago still didn't work. There's something that's still ineffective and that's not working. So just overall, the prosecutor needs to be someone that's critically thinking at all times and be willing to be pushed and to pivot based off what's best for the community. And community includes everyone, not just the folks that we see as criminals or victims.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that perspective and sharing that with everyone. And Mary, I would love to hear from you too, like what kind of things you see happening in a progressive prosecutor's office that would make change in community. And I would also love to hear how, I mean, your many years as a public defender informs your views on those policies and issues.
For many years, when I heard people talk about reform in the system, it always was on end kind of stuff like expungements, which is really important for people, and reentry, which is important. But I always thought we should be focusing, and John has talked about this, on front end. You know, how do we keep people out of the system in the first place? Because the system, by and large, harms people. Prison is a violent place. It harms people. So what can we do to hold people accountable? Because that is important, and it is a different concept than punishment, by the way. Kevin and I have talked a lot about his story, and his story really had a big impact on me because I think about an 18-year-old young man. I think it's very important to approach youth from an adolescent brain development perspective. We know that youth are impulsive. They're very susceptible to peer pressure. It's hard for them to say no when they're in situations and somebody that they're with is doing something that they know shouldn't happen. In fact, there was a terrible tragedy with some youth that were in a car that were fleeing a police officer, and one of the youths in the car was on the phone talking to someone saying he didn't want to be part of this, and unfortunately he ended up being killed in the subsequent car crash. So I think about Kevin's case and I think, well, you know, we're very unique in the country in terms of our felony murder rule, but why in the world would a prosecutor indict an 18-year-old child, basically, on first-degree felony murder, which I believe carried life in prison, right?
Yes.
When he was part of a robbery, but did not have the gun, did not intend for anybody to die, and somebody else pulled the trigger. And so I think about the power of prosecutors, and I think, you know, you have the choice not to charge that. You can make the decision not to charge that case. You can handle it as a robbery. You can make the choice that Kevin Reese should not have had to go to prison. That's the power of prosecutors. You know, in terms of reforms, I can say pretty much everything John mentioned is not happening in Hennepin County. So those are things that are very important. Approaching substance use disorder from a public health perspective and recovery perspective. We approach it typically from a punishment. And, you know, the number of judges that have said to me in my career as a public defender, well, your client got to go to treatment once or twice, that's it, or that put the person on probation with conditions that they not use, and then when they use, they were sent to jail. And we know that that's part of recovery. So we have to be able to look at these issues from a public health lens. We have to look at kids as kids. The system maybe shockingly, doesn't really recognize trauma very well. Judges don't recognize trauma. We don't really have very good trauma-based treatment programs, things of that nature for youth that bring in trauma. But here's a huge thing that I want to talk about, and I've talked to Kevin about it as well. And I know that John didn't describe it, didn't call it this, but that's part of what they're doing, is restorative practices. Yep. And I am a huge fan, and I would recommend this to everyone. There's a woman by the name of Danielle Sered who created a program in New York called Common Justice. She's written this brilliant book called Until We Reckon. Her language also is, she will call people harmed parties and responsible parties. And she runs a restorative justice program for violent offenses, except for sexual assaults and domestics, in ages 16 to 26. And it's a long program, over a year long, because you're addressing somebody's trauma. They have to take meaningful accountability. And it's, they have to address their issues, and it's also at the option of the person who is harmed. And in my class here, in my clinic, I teach 2 classes here, but in my clinic, one of my students said, well, if you just have to apologize, how is that going to deter anybody? And I said, let me give you a really simple example. You steal a candy bar, would you rather be grounded and have your electronics taken away, or would you rather be marched down to the store with the candy bar or make restitution, look the person in the eye, apologize, hear the impact it had on them, and do some work around the store? I think pretty much everybody would say, I'd rather be grounded. When you're grounded and you're in your room, you make yourself the victim, right? You think, oh my God, they have 10,000 candy bars, and why are my parents so mean? And you're thinking about yourself. You're not thinking about the impact that you had on the person you harmed. Really simple example there, but one example that Danielle Sered told of a real case she had was of a person who was robbed. And he could no longer walk to his bus stop or transit to go to work because he was too frightened. He had a physical response. And so he was having to pay for Ubers that he didn't have the money for. And he was given an option of restorative practices. And his mother was really interesting. You know, Danielle Sered talks about his mother and says, her response was, if I had a machete, I'd chop the kid up who did this into little pieces. So she was not doing this out of, trying to improve the life of the person who harmed her son. But she said, if my son is ever going to recover from this, I think we have to go this route, which is a really important point. When you talk to people who've been harmed, they almost always say, 1, I don't want this to happen to anyone again, and 2, I have all kinds of questions, and I want to be able to walk down a path towards healing. And I guarantee you the traditional system doesn't offer any of that. So interestingly, back to this robbery case, the kid who committed the robbery said at one point, I know self-defense. Can I teach him how to defend himself? And I'd ask you to imagine that ever happening here. But they worked it out over time. They went to a professional martial arts studio. They taught the kids some self-defense techniques. And then the kid who robbed him started holding him. And the kid who was robbed got away. And then they did it over and over until the guy who robbed him was holding him as tightly as he could. And he got away. The next day, Danielle Sered got a phone call from the person who was robbed, and all she heard was, nothing happened. She said, what? And it was from the young man who had been robbed, and he said, I went to the bus stop this morning and nothing happened. I'm okay. And in fact, this happened in New York, and he said, I'm in Times Square. I'm okay. I'm not afraid anymore. And I hear a story like that, and I think, why is this not what we're trying to do in the system? Because offering restorative practices, you are offering this person who's been harmed an opportunity to heal and get back, get something that they actually want. You're getting the person who committed this harm to take meaningful accountability. He could have gone to prison And, in my conversations with Kevin, prison is pretty easy for some people rather than actually having to look the person in the eye that they harmed. But you have to take meaningful accountability. You have to apologize, and as Danielle Surratt says, do the apology. And guess what her recidivism rate is? 7%, which is unheard of here. Our rates at which people come back are half to, more than that. So that's another type of practice program that I think is absolutely essential that we need to start building out here as an option for people who are harmed and those who do harm.
Can I say one thing?
Yeah, of course.
Currently, it's so much of the complete opposite here. It's illegal for me to say sorry. Like, there's a family connected to while I went to prison. It's on my heart. It's why I'm here. It's why I dedicated my life to this. In Minnesota, the way the restorative justice practices is, the state says, no, it's part of one of my conditions of parole that you can't say sorry to the victims, or you can't be in community with the folks that was impacted by it. And no one asks me, like, Kev, I got a big old sorry on my heart. There's no space. I sit here today still with this gap where it's actually illegal to do that process. It's actually illegal to not only apologize, but to do the apology. So yes, that's back to your question. It's one of the things that the county attorneys can also do as well. Not charge folks for wanting to be sorry or be in community in that way. Minnesota has a long way to go to get to New York.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's so important that we reimagine what justice and healing looks like. We are getting to the end here. I definitely have more questions, but I want to open it up to everyone else. If anyone has questions for any of the panelists, feel free to. Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, Andrew Marquardt from Great North Innocence Project. Thanks for being here today. John, you alluded to this a little bit about the progressive prosecution movement becoming something of a scapegoat for rising crime rates. And I got to say, just on a personal level, I've been cheering on the progressive prosecutor movement for recent years, including you, John. And I'm terrified that this movement is about to run headlong into a brick wall. And I think that would be a horrible tragedy, because I think all of the reasons it was such a compelling alternative vision for prosecution in 2019 still apply in 2020. But the politics are, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know, are really sticky. And ultimately, the two of you have to convince your respective counties that your vision of the justice side is the right one. So do you have any ideas for how to communicate with the public in this time where there actually is rising crime?
Yeah.
People are genuinely concerned in a way that can convey that these projects that we've started are still worthy and we shouldn't turn back?
Well, thanks for that question. And I belong to a number of reform-minded networks, one of which is Fair and Just Prosecution. So we've devoted a lot of time on the communications issues and just the lay of the land. We're all experiencing the same thing. We're all being blamed for the rise in crime and the carjackings and all of those particular things, right? And you are very correct that we are in a very precarious moment right now. We've got an election in Hennepin County. I don't have an opponent, but I know that there are certain interests that are trying to find a candidate to run against me. And but the big one is in San Francisco with Chesa Boudin, who's on the ballot as a recall. And some of the polling that's coming back is not looking so good for him. So I think one of the things that's happening right now is you've got this really horrible kind of coincidence of the pandemic, right? And then you've got this people lashing back at this movement, and the narratives that the people who are pushing back are actually working, and they're working because we, as Americans raised in this country, we've been conditioned to think that way, right? It worked against Michael Dukakis with the Willie Horton ads, and a lot of this also has a lot to do with that, capitalizing on the fear and also racism, right? We're seeing it actually play out right now in Minnesota in the legislature, where you have a certain party that is looking at or saying things out loud that is saying, oh, look at all the crazy things that are happening in St. Paul and Minneapolis. They have prosecutors who won't charge people, all of these things. So right now we're kind of like, I feel like, and all of my colleagues around the country, we feel like we're on our, like kind of pushed into a corner. But we know that we've been, luckily we have some resources to kind of think about these strategies and look at some polling data. But one thing that I think that people do understand is that, universally, whether you're left or right, prioritizing your office's resources on violence, to say the message about the low-level things, we don't have the resources to prioritize, but the violence we are absolutely committed to. But we're not going to go back to this, the old ways of mass incarceration, that there are other ways to do it. So working with community and police, bringing people together to try to come up with the solutions around group violence intervention, cure violence. There's all these programs that target the problems that we have, but do it in a more holistic way. They're utilizing community at the forefront, right, of these solutions. So that's one of the strategies, I think, to talk about that. And also, we just have to get out there more and have this type of dialogue. In fact, the title of this is Movement Building, right? And we are going to be subject, we're the only country in the world that actually elects prosecutors. So we also need to organize people to recognize that we are in a very critical time, that if we want the quality of justice to be different than it was from the 1990s or the 80s when we had problems emerge, back then it was a crack cocaine epidemic, and we came up with solutions that relied heavily on incarceration, relied heavily on enforcement in certain communities. And today we reap the bad from all of that. We can now see it all, right? But sadly, in some ways, as soon as we started having the carjackings, et cetera, we have forgotten some of those lessons. But I think that I believe in the power of our democracy and people. And I know that if we organize and we mobilize and we elect progressive candidates, we can get past this. But this is a really kind of a critical time. The recall election in California is in June, I believe, and that will say a lot. And I think one of the things, too, is that in San Francisco, I think there's other things that are happening aside from the uptick in violence. There's rampant homelessness and some of those types of issues as well that I think is driving some of this. But it's not just the right that's pushing back on Chesa Boudin, it's actually the left as well, and that's where I worry about that.
Thank you. I have some questions too that people have submitted. This is for all three of you. Can you talk about how you are incorporating data and lived experience into your bail and pretrial detention policies or proposed policies? And where do you stand in efforts to reduce pretrial detention? Mary, do you want, or Kevin, go ahead.
Well, I'll start. I'm not really big on data because the system messed me up. I hate anytime we're talking about human beings and we're using numbers. But what I would tell you for sure is you stand a better chance at being able to actually see justice if you don't have to sit in the county jail. Folks being able to have opportunity to have adequate defense throughout that space, and the county jails is worse than prison. The county jails is designed, it's going to mess with you holistically. So folks, it just shows that folks that is out on bail actually have a better chance throughout the legal process to get a favorable or fair sentencing or whatever happens, however it shakes, versus us continue to feed the beast with the plea bargains, right? Most folks is going to plea out. I don't know, attorneys, it's not like Matlock. It's not like a lot of full-fledged trials going on. Most folks plea out, and they're pleading out because they want to get out of county jails. I'm a person that sat in the county jail for 15 months. Part of the reason why I was 19 by that time, to my 19-year-old brain, take 22 years. I signed a paper for longer than I had been alive. And one of the driving factors was to get out of the county jail. And if I would have been out on bail, maybe I would have fought my case a little longer and a little stronger. But part of my tap out was get me the heck out of here. So innocent until proven guilty, it's a real thing. And the system monetizing, they're asking poor people, most folks who committed crime, they're poor, asking poor people to pay into the system to even have an opportunity to have a fair trial. It's kind of criminal in itself. So I would for sure say that we need to create spaces in ways where innocent to proven guilty actually looks and feels like it. Not kidnapping, pay a ransom, we'll let you go, and then we'll have a conversation a day later, right? So more of a uniformed approach to innocent until proven guilty that's not including money. There's other ways to be able to have capital. The only capital in the world is not money. There's community capital as well, and we need to lean on some of those spaces when we're thinking about having folks sitting in county jails as they're litigating their case.
Sure. Mary or John, if you have anything to add.
Just that the data on this is actually really helpful because we have plenty of data available to us about how harmful pretrial detention is. And I agree. There is a lot that we could do in wraparound services that would help people come back to court. This is a really long, complicated question, though, in a way, because we do use a risk assessment and there are race baked into that, and so I'd be happy to talk to whomever asks that question because it is a longer answer. But using data is helpful because you can show people just how harmful and in what ways pretrial detention does harm people.
And I'll just be really quick, but in Ramsey County, we've been on a 3-year journey to actually do a co-design of a bail reform project. Eli Darris, who was formerly with the ACLU, who is now co-director of the Minnesota Freedom Fund, he and I co-chair our bail reform working group, and our goal is to eliminate a wealth-based system that we currently have with cash bail and replace it with something else. And we're utilizing lived experience to bring people with that perspective and those experiences right to the table that we have formed. And we're actually co-designing a way that we will deflect people away from the jail, utilizing the power of the prosecutor as well as the sheriff from the booking desk so that they don't even have to be brought into jail to begin with. We will also rely on some risk assessment instrument, but we're co-building and designing that with our community. And we convened a town hall, and we've recruited more members of our bail reform working group that have perspective. And there's so much to learn. I used to be a prosecutor that used to believe that it was my job to go and educate the public about what we do. But I've now come to realize that really my job is to be in community, to listen and to learn from the various perspectives that have not been considered or at the table, and to actually give them a seat at the table to actually design something that would be better. And it will always be better, because if you ask people like me to try to reform the system, we'll probably tinker with it. And we'll keep the existing system, but we need to imagine something much different and much better.
Well, we're in the last few minutes here, so I just want if all of you could give us some last pieces of advice or words to law students who may be going into criminal work or maybe not, and just, you know, how they could fit into all of this. You can start with Mary and go around.
All of you, no matter what you're going to do, can play a big role here. And one of the things you can do is to understand the system as much as you can. And also, you know, I'm thinking about a lot of the misinformation that's out there and the messaging that I have been hearing when I've been talking to people when I've been campaigning. And a lot of it, you know, people will say to me, oh, you know, what's happening? Violent crime is being caused by the county attorney's bail policy. And I know that that's not true, because I have the bail policy and it has no violent crimes on it. And so there's just so much that's misinformation. And it just, somebody starts that narrative and the media picks it up, and the next thing you know, voters think that that's actually what's happening. So I would encourage all of you to really get involved, learn as much as you can, and have conversations with your networks, your voter. Everybody's got to get out there and vote, and they have to educate people about what's really happening in the system and what's not, and what you want and what your networks want in prosecution. So I just encourage you all to really get involved in these elections. Local elections really matter. I mean, the county attorney's races are so important, and partly because the county attorney has probably, well, I think without a doubt, the most power in the system.
Yeah, for sure. I would say don't forget this version of yourself. Don't forget the individual that you are sitting here today, and whatever that is. As you begin to work in and within the system, don't forget, after you become attorney, don't stop being an attorney. Continue to challenge the law. Continue to push. Continue to challenge. And you literally can make a difference. Whatever the future looks like, whatever 20 years from now looks like, the world that we live in, it does not have to be this way. And the key to that is sitting in all of our hands, including all of y'all. So, and also, some relational organizing perspective as an attorney, to understand that you are a community member. So your perspective on working with folks for it to be through and beyond the process of the courtroom, because this person was a community member before they ever came to a courtroom. They're a community member while they're in the courtroom, and they will be a community member when they leave the courtroom. I've had an opportunity since I've been home to be in community with my paralegal, who was the paralegal on my case when I was in prison so many years ago. And it was probably one of the more healing moments for me to be in community with someone that was through and beyond that experience. And I remembered this paralegal because throughout that process, she made me feel human. I had a public defender in Hennepin County, but the paralegal, she was great. I didn't even remember her name, but I remembered her spirit. And it did so much to me that when I came home, she intentionally reached out to me and has been a part of my community. So I would just urge all of you all to see yourselves as the community member that you are now, and take that with you everywhere you go.
I'll just add very quickly that, and don't ever forget this, is that when it comes to policing in our criminal justice system, all of you own it, right? It has to belong to the people, right? And as you are trying to think about making changes in that system, even if you're not within it, you own it, right? And ask yourself this question: are there people who need to feel like a sense of ownership but don't have a sense of ownership, right? And make sure that they are a part of those conversations. But I think that's the most fundamental thing in our American democracy, that we believe in civilian control of our police and our criminal justice system.
Great. Well, thank you so much to all three of you for coming out here and sharing your work and your thoughts. Really appreciate it. Let's give them a round of applause.